further ado, I'll just say that today's class is very appropriate, I feel, for our conversation now, because it's really about relationships and what happens when there's a shadow, when there's change, something that casts the relationship into shadow and forces us to reformulate them. I just want to say one thing as an introduction, and then I think what we're going to do is delve right in and take it from there. I know that in principle, what we did until now, before we hit Tehillim, what we did is we covered whatever were the chapters of the month that passed between when we last met and now. With Tehillim, I chose a slightly different approach. I'm not religiously sticking to those psalms that are in that period of time. I'm trying to stay vaguely in that borders, but I chose to focus on different aspects of the Psalms with every one of our meetings. Because we're going to have several meetings about the Psalms, I figured it would be more useful to take a different entryway in terms of theme or topic or a motif every time. And the theme or motif I chose for today is a very natural continuation of what we did last time. You don't need to remember everything we discussed last time to understand it. I'm just saying that last time we finished by saying that Tehillim changes the framework of religiosity, or offers an additional or alternative framework of religiosity. Namely, after reading the Torah, reading Moshe's speech in Deuteronomy, we get the sense of a Jewish life that's based on choosing right from wrong, on following God's orders, on doing what we are supposed to do, and not being tempted by evil deeds, idolatry, etc. And then we reach the Psalms, and all of a sudden, righteousness is defined less by the kind of deeds that are allowed or not allowed, and more by what are we rooted in? Are we rooted in our relationship with God enough not to be swayed by other people and their temptations and their ideas and everything that's going on around us? Or are we not? And if we are, that's the righteous man. That's the man who in the first psalm is described as the righteous man, who is rooted like a tree that's rooted in water and is focused on God. And if not, then we will blow in the wind like moths, like dry wheat. We will blow in the wind, and that will be the opposite. The opposite will not be being an evil person. The opposite will be not being rooted in a relationship with God. So this is all very nice and well to say that religion now depends on our relationship with God. But as we know from life, these kinds of ideas have, how to put it, it's not enough to say, oh, our religion now depends on our relationship with God. We have to ask, what is this relationship? What does this relationship look like? What does it feel like? How does it shape the soul's terrain? How does it shape our inner life? What does it do to us beyond its religious significance to being righteous because we are rooted in this relationship? How does it affect our ideas? How does it affect the way we relate to other people? How does it affect our marriages? How does it affect everything and anything about our life? And this is where we're gonna take this conversation today. So without further ado, as soon as I figure out how to use this, okay, thank you, I got it. I wanna start delving a little bit into what David's, or the poet's, relationship with God does to him, and what terms and what images and what metaphors does he perceive it, and use that to try and kind of dig our way into his state of mind and see what inner life Tehillim opens up to us, what kind of life it models, what kind of soul it models for us. And I want to start with a very, very familiar Tehillim, with a very familiar psalm, Psalm 27. Familiar because we read it from Rosh Chodesh Elul until Yom Kippur, so we recently had about 40 to 80 opportunities to repeat it. And let's just start with its beginning. It's beautiful in Hebrew, but I'll read it in English. But the Hebrew is right there for you if you wish. Of David, the Lord is my light and my help. Whom should I fear? The Lord is a stronghold of my life. Whom should I dread? When evil men avail me to devour my flesh, it is they, my foes and my enemies, who stumble and fall. Should an army besiege me, my heart would have no fear. Should war beset me, still would I be confident. One thing, wait, I'll pause here for a second. So far, David doesn't sound so different from other people who raised their voice in poems in the Bible. This feeling of confidence, of God will protect us, God will help us, this is something we're familiar with. Let's look, for example, at the famous poem of Dvorah. Upon leading and inspiring the people to a great victory against the Canaanite kings in the book of Judges, Dvorah says in the next source here, Judges 5:1-3. On that day, Dvorah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang, when locks go untrimmed in Israel, when people dedicate themselves, bless the Lord. Hear, O kings, give ear, O potentates, I will sing to the Lord, will hymn the Lord, the God of Israel. She's not saying exactly the same thing David is saying, but the feeling of confidence, of almost an exuberance that comes from the sense that we have utter and complete confidence that our heart can never falter, rings here again. Let's look at the other, perhaps the most famous of them all, of the great thanks poetries of the Bible. Let's look at what Moshe and the people sang after God opened the sea. Then Moshe and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. They said, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver, he is hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and might. He has become my deliverance. This is my God, and I will enshrine him, the God of my father, and I will exalt him. The Lord, the warrior Lord, is his name. Before we continue with this, I would like to ask you a question. Just based on these three passages, the few psukim from Psalm 27, the few psukim from Dvorah's poem, and the few psukim from the poem we sang after crossing the sea, how would you describe the relationship between the poet in each of these cases, or the poets, if I'm grouping them together, and the God they're talking about? What kind of relationship is it? What are the roles of the prospective partners in this relationship? I'll start it more easily. What is God's role in this relationship?
Protector.
Protector. Thank you, Donna. Yeah, what?
Stronghold.
Stronghold. Okay, so you're saying slightly different, you're using different words, but the sense you're conveying is similar, if I understand correctly, that he is something for us to rely on. Anybody wants to challenge that or take it in a different direction, or say what is our part in this relationship?
It seems our part is that we have faith in God. It sounds like it's joyful, like, this is exciting. I can go forth in the world because God is my protector. And I have faith that you're going to do the best thing by me, and I'll do my best, but I have faith that you're going to do your best.
Is this joy part of the contractual obligation in the relationship? Meaning, is this joy something we owe God in this relationship, or is it just a product of the relationship in our own life? In your opinion, just from these here, I'll open it again so everybody can see it. Does it look to you like it's a reciprocal thing when God offers us protection and we offer him our joy, or it's just he offers us protection and therefore we are joyful, but it's not something he necessarily expects? Yes, Jael. Jael or Yael?
Jael.
Jael.
Yep. It sounds to me like there's a long-term relationship which is intimate, that there's a reliance on that this is something new, this is something that we're used to, and rejoice in that stability.
It goes interestingly with your choice of words when you said stronghold, right? That it's something very stable. And you're right. It's not the words of someone falling in love. It's the words of someone who already been in many scrapes in the past and knows that they can rely on this relationship. This is a very good insight. But still, I keep coming back to the same question because I think it's important. When Dvorah, for example, says here Hear, O kings, give ear, O potentats, I will sing to the Lord, will hymn the Lord, the God of Israel. Is she paying her dues? Is this something God expects of her, or just her spontaneous expression? And what does it sound like to you?
I go with spontaneous expression.
Yeah.
At least for the Devora and the Shirat Hayam seems spontaneous. In the Tehillah itself, might have a bigger perspective that now he knows going forward. It can be relied on.
Mm-hmm. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Does anybody disagree or want to add something different? Let's keep reading and see if it changes. Okay, if it stays in the same register, emotional register. I'm going back to the Mizmor we were reading, back to verse number 4. One thing I ask of the Lord, only that do I seek, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, to frequent his temple. He will shelter me in his pavilion on an evil day, grant me the protection of his tent, raise me high upon a rock. Now is my head high over my enemies round about. I sacrifice in his tent with shouts of joy, singing and chanting a hymn to the Lord. How do you feel that the first part of the Mizmor, the part where he expresses his confidence and how he's never afraid because he knows no matter what, God is with him, how does it relate to his desire to be in God's home? How do you put these two parts together, in your opinion? There's no right answer. This is poetry. Anyone? Yes, child.
And it seems to me that the stronghold is long existing in time, been there for a good long time. The temple is something to be looked forward to.
Mm-hmm.
Chances are it will be right in the same site as the stronghold, but it's something that is a distinct structure that he'll rejoice in as a new gift.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting point, and I think it's in Hebrew the distinction between these words, like stronghold, would be metzudah or something like that, which we do know that David in other poems uses as an image for God, metzudah, like a castle or a stronghold, really. Whereas bait has a very different emotional flavor to it. A bait is not necessarily as protective, it's not necessarily as fortified, but it's intimate. It has a sense of intimacy to it. What is it, when I say bait, what do you think of? What comes to your minds? In one word. Yes, Naomi.
I mean, the protectiveness of a home. What I was going to say about the passage that we just read was a little bit, I sense, excuse me, a plea that even though David is grateful and David is talking about his devotion to Hashem, a little bit there's also a plea that please stay with me, please protect me.
That's very interesting because it introduces to what otherwise would look like a complete statement of joyous confidence, exuberant confidence, this sense of insecurity, the sense of maybe this fortress will be snatched away. And we can read it like that, or we can really make the distinction between fortress and bait and say that maybe he wants more. Maybe it's not that he wants it not to go away. It's not that he doesn't want to lose that protective connection with God. Maybe he wants something beyond that, a sort of intimacy that is somehow more than just protectiveness, than just being saved from enemies. Because it's one thing, as we all know, when there are external enemies to fight against, people unite, right? When there's all those enemies, God will stand up for him. But it's not quite the same as having an intimate relationship. We see it whenever there's a threat on the Jewish people, and suddenly we all set aside our, 2 Jews, 10 opinions problems, and stand together, and then the next day we are ready to kill each other once again. Well, metaphorically, hopefully. So, but most of the time. But so maybe the hint we're hearing here is not just fear of loss. It's really this craving for something that goes beyond that protection. But I have a question, and I'll reopen the thing so we can all see it. But is he addressing this to God? This wish for being in God's home? Who is he addressing it to? At verse 4.
Mhm.
He's telling us that. He's telling us, the audience, there's this one thing I want from God, and I ask for it, which is to sit in the house of God all my life. He's not saying, God, please, I'm asking you, take me to your house, let me be in your house, etc., etc. It's still in the third person. It's almost as if he can't quite have that intimacy or that closeness of a direct conversation. And maybe that's what he means. Maybe what he's asking for when he's asking for a home is exactly that ability to talk to God face to face, as an I talking to a you. But then something really amazing happens, because the poem continues and totally changes. After the first 6 verses, where the overall register, the overall emotion we hear is joyous confidence with perhaps a hint of wistfulness for something else, suddenly we hear of totally different emotions. Let's go down to box number 2, and I'm going to continue directly with what follows in the poem. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud, have mercy on me, answer me. Suddenly, we're talking about crying, we're talking about the need for mercy, the confident man who feels unthreatened disappears. Suddenly in his place, we see someone who's beseeching, someone who's in need of help, someone who is speaking not in the third person. And he goes on to say, in your behalf, my heart says, seek my face. Oh Lord, I seek your face. Do not hide your face from me. Do not thrust aside your servant in anger. You have ever been my help. Do not forsake me. Do not abandon me, oh God, my deliverer. Whatever hints of fear of losing God's protection, as Naomi said, or whatever hints of wistful desire for something more, here bloom into this heartfelt, direct, and explicit statement. Suddenly he acknowledges that he's not sure that God will continue to protect him. Suddenly he acknowledges that he feels himself in need of mercy. He acknowledges that he wants to see God face to face. And he goes on saying those famous words in verse 10, though my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will take me in. Show me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my watchful foes. Here he's not saying, I know that I don't have to worry about them because you lead me. No, he's saying, please do it. Please protect me. Do not subject me to the will of my foes, for false witnesses and unjust accusers have appeared against me. Had I not the assurance that I would enjoy the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, which is an odd statement that the commentators are not sure how to read. Some read it as an expression of confidence. That gives him confidence that he believes that he will see the good of God. And some interpret it as a request, like, please, wouldn't it be nice? Like a wishful thinking kind of hoping this. This is remarkable. This is a remarkable mizmor where confidence transforms into lack of confidence, for lack of a better word, into this feeling of dismay and fear and dependence. And where speaking in the third person about God turns into speaking in the first person. So we started by asking, what is the relationship between God and man in the first part? How does it change in the second part? Does anybody want to venture a thought or an insight here? Donna? You're muted. Yeah.
It seems like he was crafting like the perfect prayer. He starts by exalting God and connecting to God from afar, but with exaltation. And then he goes down to the specific. So first he makes God feel good and connected, and then he asks for his bequest.
Yeah. I see you nodding there, Cheryl. You're in agreement with Donna? Just, you're muted. We can't hear you.
I forgot I'm on video. Yes, no, I totally agree. I was thinking the same thing, that it's starting with the kind of the formulation for prayer and showing, not talking to God, and that, but then deep down, maybe he doesn't reveal his insecurities, let's say, to like the general public, but like for himself, and just beseeching God.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, just a second, Jill. I just wanted to catch the word you said, Cheryl. Public, I think, is very important here, and I'll come back to it in a second. Jill, you wanted to add something?
I gather a little bit more dark here in from verse 7 on, is that in the first 6 sentences, he's rejoicing in the Lord, he's eagerly anticipating. And just like you and me, we can know that God is present, but we can't see him. We have to have faith and hope and wish he would be more obvious than he is. And David is saying, basically, you didn't answer my other prayer. Can't you please hear me? And he's asking for reassurance.
Are you saying that the first prayer is unanswered and that's why he's asking for reassurance, because he spoke in confidence, but now he's second guessing himself? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That there's almost like this moment of drunk confidence, and then wait, is it for real? It's almost like falling in love, or any other strong emotion, that at first there's this overwhelming emotional security or certainty, and then there's doubt because it felt so grand, but how does it fit in our reality? It's not something we can measure rationally and tangibly.
Well, that's a prayer experience that I bet a lot of us have had, that when we remember past prayer experiences, we remember the good and how exciting it was. And it's a little golden in our memory, more golden than it was in reality. We ascribe joy to it because we did receive some joy. But here, David is saying, I didn't get what you were promising me. What can you do now? Help me, please. So he's a little bit desperate. It strikes me as being a tiny bit of theodicy, trying to give God an out for why he didn't answer my prayer.
Yeah, so in a sense, what you're saying is that when he says, my father and mother abandoned me, where are you won't, it's more like he's like, you won't, right? Like he's waiting for God to say, yes, I won't, of course I won't. But it's not necessarily what is he really feeling. It's not really where it's coming from.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, and we can read it in different ways. We can read it as a more formalistic way of arranging our prayer. We can read it as this moment of enthusiasm and then second guessing. We can also, and this is the interpretation of Rabbi Elchanan Samet from Gush Etzion suggests in his articles, we can also treat it as 2 states of minds that all humans are familiar with. We all familiar with those moments when we feel like we're kings of the world, like everything aligns before us, like the world works out, everything is good. And we don't need to see God. We don't need to feel God because we see his presence in our success. It's like, it's not God. We may thank God, but we don't need him. It's kind of ridiculous, right? It's like that joke that a person is drowning and is praying, God help me, and then a boat comes by and he says, never mind, taken care of. So it's like we're in an odd way, we're thankful to God, but it's almost like God is a second thought, because our experience right now is of success, of confidence, of being in our element. And then there's those moments that are sorry, very, very different. Those moments when we feel lost and insecure and inconfident, and we wonder if we can find God. And maybe those two parts are reflecting those two kind of experiences we have. One of them is more public. That's why I like, Cheryl, the use of that word before, because it's more, has to do more with moments when we feel so at our element that we're not afraid to show it to the world. And the other is more private, because we don't usually like airing all our doubts and insecurities. I mean, you know, to some extent we do, but it's this moment of existential insecurity. And then we turn to God, and privately, instead of talking to everybody, instead of writing on Facebook, my day is going great. I thank God, my day is going great. Talking to the public, we then turn off the computer and turn to God and say, but God, really, what's going on with me? It's like suddenly the direct speech here expresses it expresses closeness, but it's a closeness that comes from crisis. It's a closeness that comes because we really are desperate and need something. And interestingly, we see it in Tehillim and other places that move from the second person to the first person, not second person, third person talking about God, to suddenly in moments of crisis, talking to God in the first person, talking to God in the second person, talking to God as a you and not as a he is great, he is wonderful, but rather you. Another famous example, for example, is from the Psalm we sing on Surah Shlishit, Psalm 23. Let's look at it carefully together. It says, a Psalm of David, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me to water in places of repose. He renews my life. He guides me in right paths as befits his name. So far, the poet is telling us how great everything is, and God remains a he to him. And then he says, though I walk through a valley of deepest darkness, gates al-Mavet, the valley of death, I fear no harm, for you are with me. It's at that moment, the moment where we're no longer talking about green pastures and various lovely vistas. It's that moment when we're in the valley of death that suddenly God becomes a you to the poet. So what we can already see just from these two examples is that the relationship that Psalm describes between that I that speaks in Tehillim, that shares his inner world with us, or can be her. It's not, you know, I mean, David was a man, obviously, but it's not, I don't think it matters for the effectiveness of the experience that they express. There's this I, and the relationship he or she experiences with God is a relationship that can have different modes. It can be a relationship that's more distant in times of great confidence, in the sense that he does feel his debt to God, but at those moments, he's not talking to God. Or it can be a relationship that out of the crucible of difficult experiences, out of the valley of death, suddenly brings us to speak to God directly. And when we see that, it's easier to understand what he's asking for when he asks for the house of God, for the home of God. We don't have time to go over all the Tehillim that use this image, but this is like one of the most prevalent metaphors that the Psalms use, that the deepest desire of the poet is to be in the house of God. I'll give one more example, just here. In Psalm 84, I'm going to start from verse 3. I yearn for the courts of the Lord. My body and soul shout for joy to the living God. Even the sparrow had found a home, and the swallow a nest for herself in which to set her young. Near your altar, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. Happy are those who dwell in your house. They forever praise you, Selah. So here we see it less in a moment of crisis and more just in a moment of contemplating desire. But again, what we see is, one, a desire for safety. We're talking here about a swallow that has a nest for their young, meaning a place where they can safely raise their children, raise their chicks. But also intimacy. closeness, the joy that comes from dwelling together. But the Psalms give us other images. It's not just this image of a home with all that it entails. It also constantly repeats this image of a straight road. We saw a little bit already in Psalm 23 that he talks about the green pastures and the roads that God as the shepherd leads the people. But what we see repeating over and over again is that describing those roads as derech mishor or meisharim, various manifestation of the word yashar, straight road. So again, I want to ask you, when we try to understand the relationship portrayed here between a person and God, so we see a little bit how it has different modes. We see that the ultimate expression of this relationship is the intimacy and protection of living at home together, of cohabitating or hosting, being hosted by God. Why is it important that the road is straight, in your opinion? We can come back to this question later because we're going to keep building on this until we it's all coming together from different directions. So what I ask you now is just keep it in mind, okay? Keep that question in mind. And now that we have a little bit of a sense of and how powerful the relationship is that he describes with God, and I didn't say that, but I really should say that, for example, in Tehillim 84, he describes his desire for God as a thirst. In other places, he describes it as a hunger. It's clearly a relationship that describes and is described in images that evoke a visceral, tangible sense, which adds another layer to the idea of a home, because one of the things about a home is knowledge. And what do I mean by that? I mean familiarity. I mean that when we think about our childhood homes, we might remember big events that happened, my engagement party, this birthday party, the time somebody fell down the stairs. But a lot of our memories of our childhood home would be those repeated rituals that we can't remember any time it happened specifically, but we'll remember how the light dimmed in the window always, or remember how we played with our sister in that particular corner always. Or, I mean, I'm just sharing my own personal memories, but I think each of you can probably come up with your own, that there's a certain sense of familiarity, that going back home is going to a place where you know where things are, you know what to expect. It doesn't have the alienness and kind of the strangeness of going to a new place. It's familiar, it's known. So when the poet talks about wanting to be at home with God, it's not just the protection, it's not even just intimacy in the sense of love or emotion, it's also familiarity. It's also coming to know God so well, so viscerally, so intimately, that you're no longer constantly surprised, that you no longer have to ask, perhaps, God, are you with me? My parents are abandoning me. Are you going to abandon me? Can you please reveal yourself to me? Because you're there and you're going to know. You're going to know that he's there because you'll know him and you're not going to be constantly second guessing your relationship. But this is all to say, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of going on a tangent here a little bit, but still, all of this is to say that the relationship between the poet and God is all encompassing in Psalms. It's most vividly expressed in moments of crisis, but not only. It becomes very intimate, very I to you in moments of crisis. It's very powerful. It shapes all the experiences. It's experienced in physical terms of thirst and hunger and of walking towards God, constantly seeking his home. And my question is, where are the other people? I mean, none of us lives in an empty world where it's us and God, right? Where it's just I and God that I turn to. Furthermore, when we talked before about Psalm 27 and how there's a big difference between its first part and its second part, right? The first part, there's great confidence in God as a he. The second part, there's great in confidence and God is a you. And it really brings to mind how Rav Soloveitchik describes the difference between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. That in Genesis 1, man is created as part of the natural world. He's the last creature created. Man and wife are created together, like all the other animals are created with their partners. They don't have names. They're just this biological force that meant to rule over the other biological creatures. And God tells them, procreate and multiply. And there's no conversation. There's no encounter between God and them beyond that order. And their experience of the world, if we try and put ourselves in their shoes, is they walk into a completed world and they just start living in it and controlling it. And like David in that first part, they can say, oh yeah, God is so great. He put us in this wonderful world, but they have no relationship with God. They're not talking on talking terms. They're not on speaking terms with God. And then comes Genesis 2, where suddenly there's a second story of creation. And this time, creation is incomplete. Man is created before there are plants. Man needs to pray and till the land. And then God gives him rain. And then there's plants. And then man doesn't have where to live. So God makes him Gan Eden and man has to wait for it. And then man is lonely. And only then does God put him to sleep and creates Eve. And the powerful thing about it is that only there in Genesis 2, where man awakens to this frustrating experience of the valley of death, of not being confident, of being afraid, of wondering, will I survive it? Only there can man have a relationship with Eve. Only there can he meet her not only as a, how to call it, co-procreationist, but as a sexual partner, but rather as someone he can talk to directly and have a relationship with that has its ups and downs. And Rav Soloveitchik makes this point very beautifully in his wonderful Family Redeemed. Sorry, just a moment. When he says, in the second chapter here, we're in box number 2, we find man in labor pains, about to give birth to himself as a humanus, to an I who secedes from his surrounding, meditates upon the things of his immediate environment, and sees the environment as something separate and foreign controlling him. He strives to attain the distinctiveness of an individual who presents not the species but himself, who bears a name, identifying himself as an I, who cannot be equated with the thou. The Bible in the second chapter tells us the story of a man who lived once upon a time and disappeared forever. And the Rav, sorry, can you see this or is it not working? It didn't work? I'm sorry. I'll try again. I just realized, here, it's this. I read it, so I'm not going to reread it, but you can see it later. It's in box 2. But the point being that then he goes on, the Rav goes on to say, it is only this man who is capable of a relationship. Until man is aware of his limitation and his loneliness, he can't see Eve and feel communion with her. But in Tehillim, it's almost we see the opposite effect. It's almost as if we see the opposite effect. We have this man who goes through the valley of death and insecurity and doubt and finds God as a you that he can talk to. And his entire world, his entire inner life is shaped by this discovery, by this craving for the confidence that will come with being in God's home finally and not having to doubt on the same level. And he feels this viscerally as a hunger, as a thirst, as a passion. And as he walks through life, he prays God to give him a straight path towards himself, because that's what he wants, not to have to seek God in the crooked turns of the valley of death where he sees him through his own insecurity, but rather to see him directly face to face. And that man, who, according to Rav Soloveitchik's understanding of Genesis, should be a man who is capable of a relationship with other people, rarely talks about other people at all. Actually, that's inaccurate. He does, but let's see how he talks about them. In box number 5, other people are a threat. In Psalm 1, he says, happy is the man who has not followed the counsel of the wicked, or taken the path of sinners, or joined the company of the insolent. Other people are the villains who might take you away from your relationship with God. Or for example, in Psalm 3, a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. Already from this one verse, we see the negative role other people can play in one's life, even those closest and nearest. And then he says, oh Lord, my foes are so many, many are those who attack me. We move on to Psalm 63. My soul is attached to you, your right hand supports me. May those who seek to destroy my love enter the depth of the earth. Again, moving to Psalm 51, the famous psalm of David's reflections after Nathan comes to him and tells him off for what he did with Bathsheba. He says, have mercy upon me, O God, and as befits your faithfulness, in keeping with your abundant compassion, blot out my transgressions. Against you alone have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight. To you, so you are just in your sentence and right in your judgment. Great, he's in a relationship with God and he talks to God, but can he really say, against you alone I have sinned? What happened to the other people who were involved? What happened to Bathsheba and Uriah, the men he had executed, the men he had killed in war on purpose? Where can, what are we supposed to make of this soul, this I, who is so focused on his relationship with God that other people become either the temptation that needs to be avoided, like the evil man who will try and take you away from the road, or the enemies against whom you ask God to help you, or your detractors against whom you hope God will vindicate you, or a footnote in a story about a sin that you perceive as a sin against that God you're talking to, and how does a sin against other people? What do you make of it? What do you think? Do you think that that's a natural state of affairs? Do you think it's normal sorry, I'll rephrase my question. Is it inevitable that when someone is so invested in a relationship with God, other people will recede in their mind? Is that something you experience either through yourself or other people?
I don't know if it's inevitable, but I think it's certainly one of a number of reactions or consequences of being invested in a godly relationship.
Anybody else? Cheryl, Fox, you want to say?
Yeah. I don't know. I kind of have a sense that, or an experience actually, that relationships actually get into right form with a deeper relationship with God. Not that they so much kind of recede, but that it's like with a deeper relationship with God, a greater sense of right relationship with self happens. That allows for other relationships to be in their more healthy, right place. So the dependence, let's say, on others doesn't become diminished in an unhealthy way. It actually becomes enhanced in a healthier way because of I think relationship with self becomes more grounded with relationship with God. And so relationship with others becomes right size, if that, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think that's my experience also. I wouldn't go as far as making that a rule for reality, but I agree that it's not, I can't relate to that aspect. I mean, I can relate to that aspect in the sense that, like, again, like falling in love. Like, I remember going as a teenager, going through a time of discovering my passion for Judaism, living a Jewish life, and then suddenly discovering my passion for it. I think a lot of 18-year-olds go through that phase. And then feeling like for a while it did displace everything else, and everything else was defined by it. But I can't say that that's my continuous experience. But I'm curious, have you ever, not necessarily in your own life, but did you see other people going through what you would describe as a displacement of relationships by a relationship with God? Would you say it's a healthy state of affairs? I mean, that's kind of an easy question to answer, no?
Sorry, I guess I interpret it a little bit differently in the sense that, not to answer your question directly, but I guess when I'm reading through, like, I see it more as like you need, and I guess there's not so much discussion of relationships with others, but you need to sort of see the wrong way and interact kind of with people of different backgrounds. And, you know, in order to have a deeper relationship with God and to kind of be more true to, you know, the right, you know, way of doing things, the right path, that you need to have these other experiences. And so, I mean, I think, you know, to complete the picture, it'd be nice to have other positive relationships and not just, you know, against different enemies and whatever. But I mean, I do think that sometimes as a foil for that, in order to strengthen the relationship with God, you need to have these other things in your life.
It kind of goes into what we were saying in the beginning, that you go in the valley of death, that when you go in the valley of death, that's when you seek God directly. So in a sense, through your experiences with other people, for good and for bad, you're entering complexities, and through them you seek God. Something along these lines? Does that ring true to you? By the way, that's what I meant before when I spoke about why is he constantly talking about straight roads. I think that there's a great deal of wistfulness here, that like he meets God in those twists and turns of his life, when he has to escape his rebelling son, or when his enemies gather around him to kill me, or when he sinned and he's afraid that God is going to discard him. And just like he's craving the familiarity and confidence of being in God's home and not having to constantly work at it, he's maybe craving a way that's somewhat simpler, that's a little bit less complicated. You know, we said in the very, very beginning, before we really properly started the class, we said, like, somebody mentioned that saying that may we live in interesting times can be seen as a curse, right? And not as a blessing. So in a sense, maybe what David is saying, God, let me have this relationship without all the complications of an interesting life that makes me find you. Can I just like find you easily by like walking in the street and running into you and just be done with it and not have to seek you so much? Yes, Jael, you wanted to add?
I was thinking more that this is an extremely intimate poem. I don't think that we need to judge him for not including other people. When you're in an intimate relationship with God, it's not that you're turning your back on other people. You're just unaware of them because you're so focused on God. And he is asking for very intimate things that would be humiliating if they were done in public. Wash me with hyssop. Give me a contrite and humbled heart. That he is asking God to purify him, to bring him closer, and other people just aren't relevant at this. And it seems to me that he's not denying them their rights to it. That with God, when God is paying a lot of attention to me, that doesn't mean he's focused only on one person. He's bigger than we are. He can do many people at the same time where we can't. We're highly focused. So
That's a really, yeah, sorry.
Oh, just, I think that it's a very deep poem about intimacy, and intimacy should be held in private. You don't want to be intimate with your husband in the middle of the street. It's too precious.
I think that's a really great point, that it's important to remember that what we're seeing here is not a reflection of everything David ever felt or thought. Just a minute, can everybody turn off their, mute themselves? Sorry, because like I hear echoes and it's hard for me to focus when I hear myself half a beat later. Like, didn't I say that a second ago? Thanks. The Tehillim are not meant to be a reflection of all of, let's call him David. It's not meant to be a reflection of all of David's life. That's his personal musings and his relationship with God. Then he stops singing and he goes on to live his life with his wives, with his children, with his courtiers, with his friends, with the people he has to rule over. And that's something very important, that the Psalms, it's not supposed to be the sum all. There's the relationship with God and there's everything else in the world. And perhaps it's a mistake to try and reduce everything into this relationship with God. And yet, and a pivot a little bit from everything we said until now, what I want to finish with today is to point out that other people do have one role inside this internal relationship with God. Allowing that other people have great roles in David's life outside of those moments of communion with God, and that we're not supposed to deduce from that he has no place for them in his life. Even in this most intimate of homes, other people do have one role that isn't as enemies, threats, foils, etc. And let's go and see that just a moment. And what I think is one of the most striking passages in all of Tehillim, in Psalms 40. You, O Lord, my God, have done many things. The wonders you have devised for us cannot be set out before you. I would rehearse the tale of them, but they are more than can be told. You gave me to understand that you do not desire sacrifice and meal offerings. You do not ask for burnt offerings and sin offerings. Pause for a second. I want to point out that this sentiment, the sentiment that God wants something else other than sacrifices, is one that's already familiar from other books of Tanakh. Shmuel, when he was rebuking Shaul for disobeying God, said, you think God wants your sacrifices? God wants you to listen to him. Jeremiah, down here, you can look later, it's here in box 6. When he tells the people off, he tells them, you think God wants your sacrifices and offerings? No, he wants you to listen to him. But that's not what David says here. He starts this familiar refrain, God, you want something other than sacrifices, but then see what God wants. Then I said, see, I will bring a scroll recounting what befell me. To do what pleases you, my God, is my desire. Your teaching is in my inmost part. Inmost part in Hebrew it's more powerful. In Hebrew, it's in my intestines. It's like in my insides. I proclaimed your righteousness in a great congregation. See, I did not withhold my words, O Lord, you must know it. I did not keep your beneficence to myself. I declared your faithful deliverance. I did not fail to speak of your steadfast love in a great congregation. O Lord, you will not withhold from me your compassion. Your steadfast love will protect me always. In other words, what David says is not God doesn't want sacrifices, he wants us to listen. He says God doesn't want us to bring sacrifice, he wants us to speak. God, don't withhold your love from me, and I won't withhold the story of your love from other people. And this is where other people enter this intimate story as an audience. Just like David is inspired by God, so he inspires other people through his experience of God. And in a sense, we're coming here full circle, because we started by looking at the first part of Psalm 27, the part where he talks about God in the third person, and he says, God is great, I don't have to be afraid, God will defeat all my enemies. And I asked what relationship does he have with God there, and whether his praise of God is part of this relationship or not. Because is it something that's required of him in return for God's grace to him and God saving him? Or is it just a spontaneous revelation? So if we go back and read that in light of what he says in Psalm 40, what we see is that praising God is very much part of his relationship with God. That's the part where he repays God, where he does what God wants of him by telling us, and we are that audience, we are that great congregation he's talking about, right? Telling us about God. And so we ourselves, the audience of the psalm, become part of David's intimate, home-like, personal, private relationship with God, because through his poetry, through reaching out to us, through the generations, through the millennia, through our own different experiences, reaching all the way to us and sharing his experience. If I was a Christian, I would say testifying or witnessing, but I am not. So I'll say sharing his experience. He is closing the circle of his relationship with God, repaying God as God wants to be repaid. And so this is the idea I want to finish with today before I just say something about Rosh Chodesh, but this is where I wanted us to get today, that not only does David relate to God even in the moments when he talked about him in the third person, not only does David leave room for other people in his relationship with God. But these people are us. We are the ones completing the circle and turning David's relationship with God into a reciprocal relationship between two partners, and not just one partner who is bestowing things and another who is constantly questioning if he's going to get them and wanting more. We are the tool that David has to complete his relationship with God. And I just wanted to say, and I know I'm a minute late, but I just wanted to say one very brief thought about how all of that connects to the month and the year that we're starting now. We're starting Kislev. It's the darkest month of the year. It's the month where the nights grows longer and the days grow shorter and the weather turns foul. And we're losing these beautiful fall leaves and fall days and replacing them with, in your case, snow, in my case, probably not snow, but still unpleasant rain. And it's in this month, and not only in this month, but towards the end of the month, when it really gets very dark, that we celebrate a miracle, that we celebrate the holiday that's dedicated to the miracle of light. Just like David, we find God's revelation, the revelation through miracle, not in the broad daylight of August. We find God in Kislev. We find God in the darkness of the valley of death, in the dark and ponderous and heavy time of the year. But also, like David, we don't find it by waiting around. We find it by lighting candles. We are bringing that light into the world. Just like the Maccabees had to fight to bring God's victory into the world, and then God helped them. We light the candle, and then we say, this is the light of Pirsum Nisa. This is a light that shows God's miracles in the world. In other words, it is in those moments of the valley of death, in those moments of darkness, that we, and Salmavet in Hebrew, Gate Salmavet means the shadow, of the valley of the shadow of death. The moments we're in a shadow and we don't see light, we, by lighting a candle, we do the equivalent of what David does by turning to God and speaking to him in the second person, by calling him you instead of he. We look at God and we say, we will bring your miracle into the world. We will bring the revelation into the world, but may the revelation follow. May the light truly reach out. That's not in our hands. So I guess my bracha for all of us, and I think we will have another class before Hanukkah, but my bracha for all of us as we descend into this time of darkness of Kislev, that we will have the courage to light that first candle, to say you to God in various ways, and that God will reciprocate and make our efforts bear fruit and spread light, God willing. And on that note, I'll say goodbye.
That was so beautiful, Rachel.
Beautiful.
That was
Thank
so
you.
beautiful. I wish, I hope it's